I ate up for wanting to leave my husband after finding out he's secretly dating our babysitter and got her fired? It's strange, looking back now at the life I thought I was building and how comfortable I was in my certainty about the future. My husband, James, and I had been married for 6 years. Together for nearly a decade. We'd fallen into our roles naturally. Or so I believed. He worked as a software engineer, with long hours that he always insisted were for our benefit. I held down a part-time job in marketing, spending the rest of my time with our 2-year-old daughter. Managing a household, balancing work and parenting, and building a life for her and for us. Until recently, I was convinced our marriage was strong enough to endure anything. Like most parents, we struggled at first to find balance. When our daughter was born, she became the center of our world. But juggling our responsibilities proved harder than I'd anticipated. Especially as I felt I was increasingly the one keeping the wheels turning. That's why, when we found Anna through the agency, she seemed like a godsend. She was young, energetic, and the type of person you immediately felt you could trust. She fit into our lives in a way that was almost effortless. I'll never forget the way my daughter took to her, laughing at Anna's silly faces and games. For the first time since becoming parents, we had room to breathe. I had time to focus on my work. And we both had a bit more flexibility to focus on our relationship. For nearly a year, Anna felt like part of the family. She was with us almost every day, giving us space to work while also filling a role that I now see left us vulnerable. She would come over in the mornings, full of energy, always with a big smile and a contagious laugh that put us at ease. And she didn't just care for our daughter, she seemed invested in our family. Like she was someone we could rely on no matter what. Having Anna around made everything easier. She was there when I needed an extra pair of hands, when I felt overwhelmed, or simply when I wanted a break. She seemed to understand our routines so well that I couldn't imagine things running smoothly without her. I trusted her, and I trusted James to keep that balance as well. It was something that I thought about often and something I took as a sign of strength and stability in our marriage. I never imagined this setup would be what would unravel everything. Things began shifting subtly, so much so that, at first, I could brush off the small hints of unease. But that didn't last. It started innocently enough. I'd notice Anna and James laughing at a joke I wasn't in on, sharing a glance that felt slightly more personal than casual. At first, I chalked it up to our good fortune of finding a babysitter who genuinely enjoyed being around our family. I convinced myself it was harmless, even flattering, that Anna got along with James. But soon enough, there were other signs that gnawed at me. I'd come home from running errands and find them seated closely on the couch, talking in hushed tones that would immediately go quiet when I walked in. They'd pull apart quickly, flashing me awkward smiles, as if they were both caught in something I wasn't part of. At first, I laughed it off with them, telling myself I was just tired or stressed from juggling so much. But each time, a part of me wanted to confront the situation directly, to ask them, what's going on? The thought of doing so, though, made me feel irrational, like I was creating drama over nothing. One afternoon, I was working from home when I noticed them texting back and forth. Anna was in the living room, sitting with our daughter, while James was in his office. The messages flew between them quickly, each one making Anna smile. It bothered me more than I cared to admit, and my mind started racing. Why would they be texting so much? The more I tried to rationalize it, the more unsettled I felt. I decided to confront James that evening after Anna had left. I approached him gently, not wanting to seem accusatory. I casually mentioned that I'd noticed they'd been texting a lot lately. James looked taken aback but managed a laugh, brushing it off as small talk. He assured me it was nothing, just little things about the day or our daughter's schedule. He even teased me, saying I was getting worked up over silly little conversations. Feeling embarrassed, I let it go. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. He'd never given me a reason to doubt him before, so why should I start now? But as the days went on, my discomfort only grew. His reassurances began to feel thin, like a weak defense stretched over something bigger. Every time Anna and James were alone, my stomach knotted, and a part of me started questioning everything I thought I knew about them. I even started feeling guilty for questioning Anna's presence in our lives. Here was this young woman, someone who had practically become part of our family, and I was suspecting her of betrayal. The turning point came one afternoon that still feels like a blur. Like I'm looking back at it through a thick haze. I had come home early from work, planning to surprise James and maybe spend some extra time with Anna and my daughter. I felt guilty for my lingering suspicions, for all the doubts I couldn't shake. Part of me hoped that coming home early might clear away the storm of thoughts I'd been living in. That maybe seeing James and Anna together without the pressures of my workday would help me find peace again. As I entered the house, the silence hit me first. Usually, I'd walk into the sounds of my daughter's laughter or hear Anna singing one of those silly songs she always made up on the spot. But this time, I heard nothing. Then, faint voices floated from the living room, James's voice, unmistakably soft, followed by Anna's. My heart sank as I rounded the corner, seeing them seated on the couch, leaning close, their heads practically touching as they whispered. They looked so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice me at first. I froze, watching them, unable to believe what I was seeing. And then, without warning, Anna looked up, and her eyes locked with mine. She looked as if she'd seen a ghost, jumping up from the couch as if burned. James followed her gaze, his expression shifting to shock, then guilt, and then the worst of all, a flash of irritation. As if I were the one intruding. I didn't even know what to say. Words failed me. I turned and walked back outside, needing air, feeling like I'd suffocate if I stayed in that room a moment longer. Every step felt like a lifetime, each one hammering home a reality I wasn't ready to face. When I finally collected myself, I went back inside, ready to confront James. That night, I demanded answers. I needed to know the truth, even if it was painful. Even if it would dismantle everything I had believed about my marriage. At first, James tried to deflect, to downplay, saying it was nothing, that they hadn't done anything wrong. He insisted it was just a connection they had developed. Some emotional bond that hadn't crossed any physical boundaries. But I saw it for what it was. A betrayal. Plain and simple. A line had been crossed. And it didn't matter if they'd tried to disguise it with excuses or downplay it as harmless. The damage was done, and I felt as though my trust, my marriage, was crumbling in my hands. James's attempts at justification only made it worse. He tried to convince me that it was just a passing thing. A mistake, as he called it. He seemed more focused on trying to brush it under the rug, to save himself from facing what he'd done, than he was on how it hurt me. As if the betrayal itself wasn't enough, James somehow managed to take it to another level that I hadn't anticipated. Part of me hoped that he would apologize, take responsibility, maybe even plead for forgiveness. But instead, he twisted the situation, trying to clean up the mess he'd made by dragging Anna down with him. It was 2 days after that initial confrontation when I decided to call the agency we'd hired Anna through. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to them. Only that I couldn't bear to have her around anymore. Not with all the hurt and deceit she'd become entangled in. My daughter's attachment to Anna made it painful. But I knew I couldn't keep her in our lives. I dialed the agency, and after I explained the situation, they told me they'd already had a call from James earlier that week. According to them, he had reported Anna as unreliable and unsuitable to be around our daughter. Apparently, he'd fabricated a story, painting her as a careless sitter who wasn't up to the agency's standards. They'd dismissed her immediately based on his concerns, and reassigned her pending further investigation. I was stunned. He hadn't just betrayed me, he'd gone behind my back to get her fired. His actions weren't about protecting us or repairing the damage he'd done. He'd done it to cover his own tracks, to remove her from the picture so he wouldn't have to face her or the messy fallout he'd created. It felt like a slap in the face. Instead of owning up to what he had done, he was willing to ruin her livelihood to protect himself. My anger flared up in ways I hadn't known were possible. Not only was I betrayed, but now I was also witnessing James's lack of remorse. He'd been willing to jeopardize Anna's career and stability just to avoid accountability. It left me feeling as though I didn't even recognize the man I had married. This wasn't just about a moment of weakness or a misunderstanding. As he kept calling it. This was about a level of dishonesty and manipulation that I couldn't overlook. No matter how much history or love was between us. After learning what he'd done, I confronted him again, unable to hold back. I laid out the facts. Challenged him to explain himself. All he could do was downplay his actions, insisting that he did it for the family's well-being and to prevent any complications in our home life. As he spoke, I realized that any chance for genuine remorse or reconciliation was slipping away. His justifications only widened the chasm of distrust and disappointment growing between us. The deeper I dug into this mess, the clearer it became that I could no longer see my husband as the man I thought I knew. He'd been my partner, my confidant, and my best friend, or at least I believed he was. Now, each new revelation tore further into the fabric of that trust. After confronting James about his manipulation to get Anna fired, I found myself wondering what else he might be hiding. I went over every interaction between them that I could recall, searching for hints I might have missed. In hindsight, all the small signs and subtle moments seemed to flash neon in my mind, his lingering glances, the innocent texts, and his sudden need to defend every casual interaction. It wasn't just about whether he'd crossed a physical line with Anna. It was about the sheer disrespect he'd shown me. Our relationship, and the life we had built together. The night after my conversation with him, I lay in bed, wide awake, running through every scenario, every possibility. My mind spiraled from anger to sadness to raw betrayal. I found myself questioning everything. Not just about him but about our entire relationship. What kind of man manipulates situations like this? Plays mind games, and then expects to be forgiven without consequence? The pain of realizing that he didn't value me or our family enough to be honest weighed down on me. A heavy, suffocating truth I couldn't shake. In moments like these, the walls of our home felt stifling. Everything I looked at, the photos on the wall, the furniture we'd picked out together, our daughter's toys scattered across the living room floor, reminded me of the partnership I thought we shared. I had built my life with this man, made countless sacrifices, and put my trust in him completely. Yet, he had disregarded all of it for a fleeting connection, a thrill that he'd tried to cover up in the most underhanded way. The next day, he tried to talk to me again. I could sense a shift in his demeanor, as though he finally grasped the depth of his betrayal. He seemed desperate, promising it would never happen again, insisting that he loved me and that we could still fix things. But his words felt hollow, the sincerity smothered by the selfish choices he had made. I couldn't believe that he thought he could simply apologize and sweep this all under the rug. Every time I looked at him, I saw Anna's face, remembered her excitement to babysit our daughter, the laughter we'd shared, and her innocence in all of this. And yet, she'd been forced to bear the weight of his decisions too. I couldn't escape the fact that he had essentially taken her down with him, erasing her from our lives without her even knowing why. He'd robbed her of a job she loved. And for what? So he wouldn't have to face his own shortcomings? I knew then that I was at a crossroads. I had a choice to make. A path I had to choose carefully because it would define not only my life but my daughter's as well. As the days dragged on, the emotional toll became almost unbearable. Every morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The same ache settled in my chest. A heaviness that only grew as I went through the motions of daily life. Yet, in all of this, my daughter's bright smile and innocent laughter were the few moments that brought me clarity. I had to make my decision not just for myself but for her as well. She deserved stability, security, and a role model of what self-respect looked like. James continued his attempts to win me back, promising change, showering me with apologies that only scratched the surface of the real issues. His remorse seemed focused on the consequences rather than the hurt he'd caused or the underlying disrespect his actions revealed. When I'd mentioned that his reckless decisions had affected not only me but also Anna's life, his response was lukewarm, as if he still couldn't quite grasp that the gravity of his actions went beyond our marriage. That was another sign, a clear indicator of how little he understood about the impact of his betrayal. I couldn't help but replay his justifications in my head, each one underscoring how misguided his perspective had become. It was as if he thought he could patch things up by performing some kind of penance without addressing the emotional scar he'd inflicted. I couldn't shake the memory of Anna's face. Her confusion, her hurt. She'd lost her job, her stability, because of him. And it dawned on me that if he was willing to discard people so easily to save himself, I could no longer trust that he wouldn't do the same to us in the future. That night, I stood in my daughter's room as she slept. Her small form curled up in the comfort of her bed. The sight of her brought everything into sharp focus. I couldn't allow her to grow up in a home where she might sense the tension. Where she might one day come to understand that her father had betrayed her mother and that her mother had chosen to stay despite it all. What kind of message would that send to her about love, respect, and self-worth? I wanted her to grow up knowing that betrayal wasn't something you swept under the rug. I wanted her to understand that while forgiveness can be a powerful act, it should never come at the expense of self-respect. The next morning, I sat down with James. I told him that I had made my decision. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply laid out the facts as calmly as I could. I couldn't keep pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. Trust, once broken, doesn't simply rebuild itself because someone apologizes. It takes commitment, consistent effort, and a level of respect that I wasn't sure he could offer. I explained that, for our daughter's sake, I wanted to set up an arrangement that would keep her life as stable as possible. As I spoke, his face fell. He looked as though he'd just fully realized, what he'd destroyed, but it didn't change anything for me. The clarity I felt wasn't something I could ignore. My mind was set, and my heart, though broken, felt stronger in my resolve. Leaving a marriage isn't easy. It's not a choice anyone dreams of making, especially when children are involved. But in that moment, as I looked at him, I felt a weight lift off me, replaced by a determination to protect what mattered most, my own integrity and the example I wanted to set for my daughter. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was the one that would let me live with myself. And that was worth everything. After making my decision, the next few days unfolded with a surreal, bittersweet feeling. I had to break the news to family, to friends, to everyone who knew us as a couple. Every conversation felt like peeling away a layer of myself, exposing my raw pain over and over again, and trying to avoid the subtle, and not so subtle, judgments in their eyes. My mother, who has always been my emotional anchor, was devastated for me but unwavering in her support. She assured me that I was doing the right thing, that my daughter deserved to grow up with a role model who valued self-respect. That helped strengthen my resolve. I knew the road ahead would be tough, filled with moments when I might question my decision, but I was certain that staying in the marriage would only wear me down in ways I couldn't afford. With my decision now public, people around us began taking sides, and I found myself caught in an exhausting web of opinions and unsolicited advice. James's family, though devastated by his actions, initially tried to encourage reconciliation. They had known me as their daughter-in-law, the mother of their grandchild, and in their eyes, forgiveness was the ultimate solution. But after realizing that my mind was made up, they shifted to being supportive, promising to stay in my daughter's life no matter what happened between James and me. For that, I was grateful. Meanwhile, friends tried to understand the situation, offering sympathy and support, but there were always a few who seemed to push the idea of second chances. They saw James as just human, prone to making mistakes. They suggested counseling, reconciliation retreats, and all sorts of remedies. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't about a singular mistake. It was about the erosion of trust. And I couldn't make myself believe in a future where that trust could be rebuilt. For my daughter's sake, I made a concerted effort to keep things civil with James. We sat down to figure out logistics, our new schedules, financial obligations, and, most importantly, how to co-parent. I wanted to shield her as much as possible from the turmoil. And that required both of us to put our differences aside. James agreed to a custody arrangement that gave us equal time with her. And despite my inner turmoil, I knew it was the right decision. She needed both parents in her life, and I had no intention of taking that from her. There were also the practical aspects of splitting our life together, separating our finances, dividing up possessions. finding a new place for him to stay. Each step was like cutting away at the life we'd spent years building. And it left me feeling hollow. Even as I was convinced I was making the right choice, I knew the pain was temporary, that it would dull over time. But in those early days, it felt endless. And then, there was Anna. I couldn't help but think of her as a casualty of James's actions as much as I was. While she had been complicit in his betrayal, she was still young, and I was sure this experience had scarred her in ways she hadn't expected. My frustration with her had lessened, replaced by an odd, distant pity. I found myself wishing her well, hoping she could move on from this with a lesson learned. I couldn't hold on to that anger, it only weighed me down. And letting it go felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. During this period, I leaned heavily on the friends and family who truly understood. I scheduled my days around work, playdates, and moments of solitude to keep myself grounded. My daughter's laughter, her small triumphs, and her growing curiosity about the world became my motivation to heal. To focus on building a stable environment where she could thrive. One of the hardest parts was explaining things to my daughter in a way that made sense to her young mind. I used simple language, reassured her that both mommy and daddy loved her deeply, and promised her that we would always be there for her, even if we were no longer living under the same roof. She seemed to understand, though I could tell that the adjustment would be as challenging for her as it was for me. As weeks turned into months, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had faded over time. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd neglected, and started working on myself in ways I hadn't since before I was married. I was relearning how to be a whole person on my own. Beyond the labels of wife and mother. It was liberating, terrifying, and, ultimately, empowering. While the pain and betrayal still lingered, they were becoming easier to carry. Like scars that were no longer raw. I realized that, despite everything, I still had the capacity for joy, for growth, and for creating a fulfilling life, not just for my daughter, but for myself. I was no longer defined by what James had done or what our marriage had become. I was beginning to define myself, by my own standards, one day at a time. And in those quiet moments, as I held my daughter or sat alone with my thoughts, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen respect, dignity, and a future that, while uncertain, was entirely my own. In the aftermath of everything, I found myself entering a new chapter of resilience, piecing together a life that didn't revolve around my marriage or my husband's betrayal. It was strange at first, learning to navigate the world without the familiar rhythms of partnership. But with each day, I began to feel lighter, freer, as if I were peeling away layers of disappointment and betrayal, uncovering a part of myself that had been dormant for years. Days started to blend together as I focused on establishing a routine for my daughter and me. I wanted to create a stable, joyful environment, one where she could feel loved and secure. We spent more time outdoors, visiting parks, having impromptu picnics, or just going for drives with no real destination in mind. She was my anchor through it all, her laughter and innocence reminding me that there was still so much good in my life, even when parts of it felt irreparably broken. Though I was focusing on healing, the painful echoes of betrayal would surface unexpectedly. I'd catch myself reliving moments from the night I'd discovered James and Anna. Or I'd hear a song that reminded me of a happier time in our marriage. And a wave of bitterness would wash over me. But slowly, I began learning to sit with the pain, acknowledge it, and then let it pass. I stopped pushing those feelings away, realizing that healing wasn't about avoiding the pain but facing it, understanding it, and letting it dissolve over time. In this period, I also rediscovered the importance of friendship. Some friends drifted away, finding the situation too awkward or perhaps feeling that taking sides was uncomfortable. But others rallied around me, stepping up in ways I hadn't expected. I reconnected with old friends, people who knew me before I was married, before I became a mother, friends who reminded me of who I was in simpler times. They became my confidants, my laughter, and sometimes, my tears. I leaned on them heavily in those early days, and they were a lifeline, pulling me out of isolation and back into the world. There was also a turning point in my relationship with my mother, who had been there for me through every step. sometimes even more than I realized I needed. She listened, never once telling me how I should feel or how I should proceed, but instead giving me the space to process everything in my own time. Her quiet strength gave me a sense of security that I hadn't realized I craved. A reminder that I was still loved, still cherished, even if I felt broken. I avoided James whenever possible. Our interactions were limited to co-parenting conversations, and even those were brief and businesslike. We kept it civil for our daughter's sake, but I maintained a firm boundary, refusing to let him see the wounds he'd inflicted or the emotional chaos he'd left behind. He attempted to apologize multiple times, and even suggested counseling as a family. But I knew those efforts were more about soothing his own guilt than about repairing our broken relationship. I wasn't interested in half-hearted reparations. I was focused on moving forward, on rebuilding something authentic and solid in the wake of his deceit. Over time, the wound began to close, and a sense of peace replaced the anger. I no longer felt the sharp sting of betrayal every time I thought of James. Instead, he became a part of my past, a chapter that, while painful, had ultimately led me to a place of strength and self-assurance I hadn't known I was capable of. There were no more what-ifs. No more unanswered questions. I had given all I could to that relationship. And when it shattered, I chose myself. A choice that felt both terrifying and empowering. With time, I began to rediscover the things that made me happy on my own terms. I enrolled in a yoga class. Something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I took my daughter on small weekend trips, exploring nearby towns, visiting museums, creating new memories just for us. Slowly, my world expanded beyond the confines of betrayal and loss. I was living, not just surviving, and each new experience brought a renewed sense of purpose and joy. And then, finally, came the feeling of closure. That subtle shift when the past no longer weighed heavily on my shoulders. I had shed the bitterness, forgiven myself for the pain I'd endured, and embraced the path that lay ahead. Life was beginning to feel whole again, not in the way it was before, but in a new, unexpected way, one that was forged by resilience and self-respect. I still don't know what the future holds, but I'm no longer afraid of it. I'm ready for whatever comes, not because I have all the answers, but because I trust myself to handle whatever life throws my way. My journey isn't defined by the betrayal I endured, it's defined by the strength I found within myself to rise above it. And with that, I've found a peace that feels both hard-won and deeply deserved. After months of wrestling with anger, sorrow, and all the wounds left by James's betrayal, I started to focus more on the present and what lay ahead. Rebuilding life after a betrayal isn't simple, it's a layered process that involves reclaiming pieces of myself I'd forgotten, creating new dreams, and, most importantly, finding the confidence to move forward independently. I knew this was my chance to create something new, something that was entirely my own, and that realization became the first real taste of freedom I'd felt in years. I focused on creating a new routine with my daughter that wasn't haunted by the shadows of my old life. In the mornings, I no longer woke up with a sense of dread that had once weighed me down. Instead, I found comfort in simple, daily rituals. I'd brew coffee and sit by the window, watching the world wake up, savoring the stillness. My daughter and I would eat breakfast together, and I would soak in the joy of our small family moments, ones I was shaping with intention and love. Over time, I let go of the bitterness I held towards James, if only to free myself from carrying that weight. We spoke only when absolutely necessary, and as much as I wanted to make co-parenting work, there was still an emotional distance between us, an unavoidable chasm that I accepted would remain. For me, moving forward wasn't about forgetting what he did but rather creating a life where his actions no longer held the power to hurt me. I had a newfound appreciation for peace, and I wasn't about to let him or anyone else disturb that. Professionally, I took on new challenges, seeking projects that both fulfilled me and allowed me to grow. I threw myself into work, not out of distraction but as a way to reclaim my purpose and sense of self-worth. Successes, no matter how small, felt like victories in my journey to self-reclamation. They were proof that I could stand on my own, that I was more than a victim of someone else's betrayal. I found myself rediscovering ambitions and passions I'd shelved over the years. Ideas I hadn't had the courage to pursue until I realized I could choose to do so solely for myself. Through this journey, I came to understand how vital self-care and compassion were. After enduring something so painful, it was easy to turn inward and let self-blame take root. But instead, I made it a point to be kind to myself. I allowed myself to feel angry and hurt without judgment, acknowledging those feelings as part of the process, not something I needed to fix or get over. I began to cherish my own company, discovering that solitude could be empowering rather than lonely. I also took time to mend relationships that I had neglected during my marriage. Friends and family who'd witnessed my heartbreak were there to help me piece things back together. They were understanding, gentle, and reminded me of the person I'd been before life became complicated. Reconnecting with them was like regaining parts of my old self that I didn't realize I missed. We shared laughter and long conversations, revisiting memories and creating new ones. These bonds became my lifelines, helping me navigate the harder days and celebrate the good ones. With each passing month, I noticed my confidence building in ways that surprised me. The fear I'd once felt about being alone dissolved, replaced by a quiet strength. I learned that I was more resilient than I'd given myself credit for. I could face challenges, care for my daughter, and pursue my passions without needing to lean on anyone else. I didn't need validation from anyone but myself. And that realization was liberating. There was still a part of me that struggled with vulnerability, unsure if I'd ever trust someone fully again. But I was okay with that. I knew I wasn't ready to invite anyone new into my life. And maybe that was for the best. For the first time, I was more focused on building my own happiness than worrying about who else might or might not fit into it. I allowed myself to be open to whatever the future might bring without the pressure to conform to anyone's expectations. Looking back, it was surreal to think about how much had changed since that fateful day when I walked into my house and saw my life unravel. The pain had dulled, the anger had subsided, and I no longer felt tethered to the past. I had built something better for myself. Something stable and fulfilling. A life I could be proud of. Looking at my life now, it's incredible to reflect on how far I've come. It's been a winding journey. One filled with pain, frustration, and plenty of moments when I doubted my own strength. Yet, somewhere along the way, I discovered that my life, my identity, didn't have to be tied to the betrayal and disappointment of that fateful day. Through this process, I found myself redefining who I am and what I want from life. Raising my daughter alone has given me a new perspective. Watching her grow, seeing her innocence and resilience, has shown me the beauty of starting fresh every day. I see glimpses of myself in her. The fierce determination, the curiosity, and a budding independence that gives me hope. She's been my anchor through the storm, reminding me to stay grounded and focused on what truly matters. Her laughter fills our home. And in those moments, I'm reminded that joy is not just possible but abundant, even after heartbreak. As I continue to heal, I've embraced the reality that it's okay to be protective of my peace. I don't owe anyone an explanation for creating boundaries, especially when it comes to people who took advantage of my trust. I no longer hold on to the resentment that once threatened to consume me. Instead, I acknowledge the lessons it taught me and use those as stepping stones toward building a life filled with purpose and self-respect. Interestingly, this whole ordeal has also rekindled my commitment to self-care and personal growth. Therapy has been a constant source of support, helping me untangle my emotions and rediscover my confidence. In those sessions, I learned not to shy away from my vulnerability but to use it as a tool for introspection. Rather than feel ashamed of my hurt, I've grown to see it as a testament to my capacity for love, trust, and empathy, all traits that define me beyond this experience. Even as I look ahead, I'm grounded in the knowledge that I've become a stronger, wiser person. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive James, but I've forgiven myself for the things I once criticized, for not seeing the signs, for staying quiet too long, for feeling as if I should have done something differently. I'm done carrying the weight of those expectations. My focus now is on fostering a future where I can be free to live authentically, in a way that reflects the person I've fought hard to become. I can't say that I'm ready to open my heart to someone new. But I'm hopeful. Hopeful that when the time is right, I'll be able to share the love I know I'm capable of with someone who values me fully. Until then, I'm content in my own company, enjoying the strength I've gained, the friendships I've deepened, and the dreams I'm building with my daughter by my side. At the end of the day, I know this journey isn't over. Healing isn't a straight line, and some days are harder than others. But as I move forward, I do so with resilience and a renewed sense of purpose. I'm no longer the person who stumbled upon a betrayal that shattered her world. I'm the person who picked up the pieces, learned from them, and built a life that's better, brighter, and entirely my own.